welcome to the Precision Teaching Podcast. My name is Rick Cabina, and we are joined tonight by our co-host, Doug Kostowitz.
Howdy-ho.
Well, how are you doing tonight, Doug?
I couldn't be better. It's getting warm outside, and it's the end of the semester, so everything's looking up.
I couldn't agree with that more. Let's jump right in and talk about a few announcements. The first announcement is that for iTunes, we are going to be changing our name from Podcast Manna to the Precision Teaching Podcast. And the reason why we need to do that is if people are trying to look us up and they type in Precision Teaching, it'll come up directly, versus when they have Podcast Manna, if they type in Precision Teaching, you can kind of get to us there, but this will be a much more direct way of finding us, and not to mention it'll be more descriptive. Secondly, the software that I use only allows the most 5 recent episodes, and that is just unacceptable because we have some really good previous episodes, and once we make the change, we'll be able to listen to all of the past podcasts. For those of you listening, you have probably heard of chart shares, and maybe you've attended a few chart shares, but chart shares are ways that they have a long history. Precision teachers share data with chart shares, and it's a fun way to see what other people are doing. It's informative. It could be used in a number of different ways, not just to get together and see what other people are doing, but also if you have a school. For example, this Friday we have a chart share at Penn State. We do two a semester for the students who are doing precision teaching, and we use that chart share to look at what one another's doing, to give comments, and to help consider other interventions to make the interventions, whatever the students are doing, even better. And the documentary that I'm working on is going to capture the phenomena of chart sharing, and I've already interviewed some people. I plan on attending different schools around the United States that do chart shares, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yes, it will be. And when we were talking about that earlier, it made me think back to the first time I was at a chart share, and that was over, I guess, coming up on 12 years ago. So
12 years.
Mm-hmm.
I can't even.
Funny how.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't even remember my first chart share. I guess that isn't good.
No, well, there were so many good ones since that you just don't remember the first one.
So many good chart shares.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's move on to our article. And our article review is it's called 1 Minute Timing Improves Inners, and it's by Abigail Calkin, who happens to be our interview guest. So we picked this article to coincide with our guest who is in the interview. And Doug, both you and I have had experience with doing inners projects.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we have.
And why don't we, before we get into this, let's just talk about inners for a minute. How would you define inners?
Well, you can go very specific and talk about the way Skinner views it, but it's behavior that's just inside the skin.
Yeah.
I guess maybe just not giving it any type of mystical special powers. Just saying, hey, these are just things that go on inside the skin. They're measures. We can measure them ourselves. There's a transducer of our own private events. So yeah, they're just behaviors that are inside rather than behaviors that are on the outside.
Yes, you mentioned Skinner. For those listeners who don't know this, both Doug and I have a background in behavior analysis, and we did a lot of work and study with a behavioral perspective. And what Skinner said he would call them private events, and in the precision teaching world, one of the characteristics of precision teaching is using plain English and trying to use terms that can be understandable from anybody who isn't necessarily steeped in a technical jargon. For example, if we were talking about behavior analysis and we said positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, those have precise scientific meaning, and you'd have to understand that jargon. But if someone says inner behavior, as you described it, you could probably pick up on that pretty quickly. Inner behavior is behavior that's inside a person. But that was nicely described. Now, with the inner behavior, in precision teaching, what precision teaching has to offer is recording behavior. So defining, pinpointing a behavior, and then measuring that behavior, putting it on a standard acceleration chart, and then saying, okay, what am I doing with this? Is this something I want to increase, decrease? That's really, in a nutshell, what precision teachers do. And the inner behavior is a fascinating topic because it deals with things that happen inside of us.
Right.
And I don't know, do you ever watch HBO?
I don't get HBO.
Okay. I'm watching this new show that, HBO is great with they've had The Sopranos, and they've just had so many good shows. And they have a show that I just stumbled upon. I think it might be the second season. I'm not sure, but it's called In Treatment, and the show is about this therapist, the psychologist, and he works with different people. And it's really fascinating because what you see, the compelling drama, are these people who are hurting. They have different problems, and it's this kind, empathic therapist who is very brilliant and will help draw out whatever problems that these clients are having. And when I think about that drama, I think about inner behavior, and you think about how do we help people who are having problems. If someone's depressed, if someone is, well, you think about the emotion or the feeling or the thought, and how do you handle it? How do you intervene?
It is very difficult.
Yeah. Human behavior is very complex. And there have been all types of schools of thought that think about psychoanalysis, think about any of the humanistic brands of psychology. There are many people that have different ways of helping people or trying to help people. And in precision teaching, the inner behavior, what's neat about it is you actually have a way of, again, this is something that only occurs in yourself, so I can't see what you're doing, and I don't know if what you're reporting is correct. But then again, I don't really know what's going on inside you anyways.
Right.
And what this 1981 article talks about is a self-project from Abigail Calkin, and she was having these inner behaviors that she wanted to change, and basically that's what this article is about.
It is a fantastic article. Fantastic how she really it dives into an entire, I don't know how many pages, just description of how she measured and in turn tried different things to then change that inner behavior with some hope of changing outward behavior at some point.
Well,
so
her main
this is
variable, though, was the inners.
Right, definitely.
And she talks about positive feelings, negative feelings, and then she also talks about positive thoughts and negative thoughts. And I always like that specificity. A feeling is one thing, and a thought is another thing. And she gives definitions for both of those. And what was going on in her life is she thought, well, she didn't think, she knew, she felt this, that she was having more negative feelings about herself, and she wanted to change that. I mean, that's the bottom line.
Definitely.
And how many of us in our life, if you think about it, haven't had, one time or another negative feelings? And if you actually have a measure, and this is again why I love precision teaching, how cool would it be that if we could take, if there were some way of, and I think some people are probably doing this, but I haven't seen it yet. Oftentimes in psychology, people will have indirect ways of getting at how people feel. So you take some kind of test that's a Likert scale, and it'll say, okay, I feel sad, I feel lonely, or, of course it's more sophisticated than that. And then based on that Likert scale, you are, there might be some norm number, and then, you're happy, you're very sad, or you're in the middle. Again, I'm just making that up. But how much cooler is it that if you could actually have counts, and all of those counts could put you in different categories, so to speak.
Based on inner behavior.
Based on counts of inner behavior.
Right, that's...
If we talked about people that have clinical depression, we'd be able to actually know what the range of that is.
Be very cool. Be very neat.
So, what's really exciting about this is not only can you identify that, but you can do something about it. And what Abigail did is she tried different interventions. And those interventions were, let's see, if I recall, one of the things that she did, she talked about doing the 1 minute counting. And when I first read this, what I thought was interesting is she would write her thoughts down for a minute.
Yes. Oh, okay. So she did do a think right. Just trying to see what the learning, because there were different channels that she used. Channel again is say think count. I was trying to see because she did use some different channels, and one was writing them down. One of the interventions, and I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, is if she had a negative thought, she immediately substituted a positive thought, so forced herself to have a thought. Again, a thought is a little different than a feeling. A feeling comes with sort of an emotional response rather than the thought, which is just thinking either words or the words about that. So I feel great would be a thought, but I feel great associated with sort of a warmth would be a feeling.
Yeah.
Is that okay? So she used the thought substitution. And then she used a countdown intervention where when there was a negative, she counted down and then thought a positive. So there were some different interventions. She did use the 1 minute timing also. So there were many different ways that she was trying to discover how she could interact with the two pinpoints of negative and positive thoughts and feelings, and how she could decrease one while increasing the other.
And that's well said. She, in her article, she talks about before. And the before would be what we would call baseline. And she has her, the counts there. And then she has what's is called during one, and that would be the first intervention. And as you correctly pointed out, she did have the 1 minute timing, and then she also did this thought substitution. But what's interesting, although she noted that it was working, she also said and I actually highlighted this. I was using thought substitution for negative thoughts. I was writing in my journal every day. I was seeing a psychologist. Nothing seemed to be working. I decided if a 1-minute timing had worked on reading and math, it might work on inners. It certainly couldn't make them any worse. So that was a really interesting comment, I thought, looking at the data and saying, okay, let's try some other interventions.
And she was able to adjust this to what she wanted and how it was affecting, but it was all based on the standard acceleration charts, what she was charting, the pinpoints, the measurement. And so she was, even though she may have, quote unquote, felt like it was working, she looked at the charts and it wasn't working. So there was that count in the background that could judge whether or not it was working, regardless of how she felt about it.
And in the second during, she's starting to see some positive results, and she says towards the end of this, when she's talking about writing some things down, she said that I had never felt intelligent in my life. I decided to sit down and think about being intelligent until I felt it. I practice each day, and then she marks when she had an intelligent feeling. And she said, I realized that I could learn to feel anything, and so she capitalized on that and then concentrated on that feeling. And that really struck me, just the pure humanity of that, thinking, like, here's a person who has this negative feeling that's really bothering them. And all of us have our inadequacies, and we all have different hang-ups. And for us to be able to have this strategy where we can pinpoint what those things are that are bothering us and try some interventions and see that, wow, we can really affect our thoughts and feelings, that's really powerful.
I think the power in that statement that you just made is even further, just even the next sentence where she says that's when she had her first feelings, so she went to feeling intelligent. She had her first feelings of self-confidence, value, self-worth, so she was labeling these, and then she said, I ceased to feel that something was wrong with me. And so regardless of how, like I mentioned earlier, regardless of the outward world, she wasn't feeling that she was wrong.
Well, we now have a interview with Abigail Calkin, and let's have a listen. I would like to welcome Dr. Abigail Calkin to the Precision Teaching Podcast. Welcome, Dr. Calkin.
Thank you.
Or I should just call you Abigail.
I think you should just call me Abigail.
Well, I always like to start off the interview by asking the interviewee, how did you become involved in precision teaching?
I was a graduate student at the University of Oregon, and I was probably about 25, maybe 26, and my advisor was Barbara Bateman, and she said, look, there's this new fellow coming on faculty, and he's going to teach a class called Precision Teaching, and I want you to take it. And she said the same thing to Clay, although she didn't say the same thing to Clay. I was her guinea pig. I was the first student to take it from her group of advisees, and she wanted feedback on what I thought of it before she told other people to take it. So it was in 1967, and the quarter started the end of September. And Eric showed up, I believe it was the beginning of November. It was about the 6th or 7th of November. Before that, somebody on the faculty had known that he had a behavioral background, so he ended up showing us Ellen Reese's, the films that she had done with dog training at Mount Holyoke. Eric arrived, and so we had basically 1 month left to class. I ended up getting an incomplete, because I did a time over time rather than a count over time behavior that I was looking at. And so I did, I worked with a student, and this is very important. I worked with a student who did not use verbs in his language. And my job in January, February, March was to teach him to use verbs. And I rewarded him with paper clips. Wow. And I don't remember whether we traded the paper clips in for anything or whether he just got the small paper clips and the big paper clips. And I finished the project, and the time periods were 20 minutes, and I counted correct use of verbs, and verb omissions were the what I had for the error count. And I finished that project, I think it was on the 27th or 28th of March, 1968. And the first project using the 1-minute timing began on the 4th or 5th of April. What's that? 2 weeks, 10 days later, something like that. Or excuse me, a week or 10 days later. And that was done by Ann Starlin in her classroom. And at this point, this winter quarter, when I was working on the project, Ann and Clay were in Eric's, they weren't sure. Ann and Clay either took Eric's precision teaching class winter quarter or they took it spring quarter. But this would have been spring quarter that the 1-minute timing started. And in going back and talking to both Harold Kunzelman and Eric Houghton, they each initially gave the other credit for who started the 1-minute timing. But what probably happened was Harold was living in Seattle. He was the head of the EEU, the Experimental Education Unit, and he was a real mover and shaker in special ed in the state of Washington. And it was either a weekend with wine late in the morning, very late in the night, early in the morning, or some other kind of thing, or it was a phone call. Neither one of them could remember. And Eric said, well, I'll bet you Harold might have come up with it, and because of all the work he was doing with students. And Harold said, I bet you Eric came up with it, because that's the kind of thing he'd do. So they both gave it to one another. So I really can't tell you who started it. I do know that they got into trouble with Og, because Og said, no, you can't do that. You have to look at all the behavior that's occurring. And, well, we all know the answer to that one.
So
in short, go ahead.
Let me, before we get more into this, I want to talk a little bit more about your background. So Eric, in 1967, came out to Oregon.
Correct.
And that's where Barbara Bateman said you should take this course on precision teaching. So I'm just trying to think how this works, because precision teaching, when that was developed, that must have been all so new. Eric must have just learned it recently from Og and then went out there and started teaching it. Is that right?
Sort of. The blue chart, the very first blue chart, which said protege on the where it now says behavior, I found out from Dennis Ettinger was actually printed for use in September 1967. So yes, it was very new. The other part that I'm not sure of in what you said was Og always credited Eric and Ann Duncan and Carl Koenig and other initial students with helping him develop the chart. So, and as I looked at the history of the chart, giving that presentation at ABBA the May after Og died in 2005, May 2005, as I looked at all those beginning charts, and even going back further, Og began, the cumulative recorder, of course, is frequency-based, and then the semi-log comes from, or the log comes from Og's background in engineering. And so what I have found so far in the archives is the very beginning use of a semi-log graph, and I have to call it that because that's what it was. I mean, I came across some log and some semi-log graphs that were from the probably mid to late 60s, I would say, was when he started playing around with that paper. But he wasn't really playing around with it. He was using something that he probably bought at the Harvard University bookstore that was in the engineering section. And so it was, then he began to do it, and he did it both horizontally, sorry.
That's okay. I thought you were coining a new word there.
I work on that. He did it both, well, as we would call it now, landscape and picture format. And then from there, we ended up with a chart that had 200 day lines on it, and it was black. And it was very hard to read. And so when Eric started teaching this course in November of 67, one of the things he brought with him was some of the early samples, which was a chart with the blue lines, but it was on pink paper. Excuse me. And I since have had from Sarah Kirkland, she has given me some charts that she's on OG's archive committee. And she's given me charts that have red lines, yellow lines, green lines, orange lines. So this was prior to September of 67. And so that was when they printed DC-EN8, which was the 8th iteration of the chart. I don't know as the others are numbered or if they were numbered. Nobody's that I know of has come across that in the archive yet. So going back to to my beginning, as I looked at this, I thought, even though just a minute, forgot to bring my water with me, even though I knew that, what did I know? Even though I had only about a month's worth of charting and I'd done it wrong, I knew that I had an extremely valuable tool in my hands. And a part of that was, just coming in my own experience from a family where my father was a chemist and my mother was a very analytical person and my sister was a chemist, my grandfather was a chemist, my brother's a geologist, that somehow I knew in my mid-20s that I had something really good here. And I have always said, and if anything better comes along, I will take it. Now, 1967, that's 42 years ago, and nothing better has come along. So
that's spoken
what
like
happened?
A true scientist.
Pardon?
I said that's spoken like a true scientist.
Thank you.
Yes.
The other thing that happened was that Diana Dean came out to visit Eric. I think it was the spring of 68. I'm sure it was. And she and I hit it off immediately. It's one of those moments where you walk into a room and you see someone and you know that you could be a good friend with that person. Mm-hmm. And probably at the end of 20 minutes conversation, the friendship had strongly begun. Eric was supportive of my investigations into inner behavior, but it was really Diana who that I spent much more time talking with about inner behavior and what is it, even to the extent of, when I had, before I came to Oregon, I was living in Scotland and I'd had 3 years of studying philosophy. So when somebody first told me to use behavior modification, I knew they were totally wrong. And I had every possible philosophical objection to it. And this man patiently listened to me for 3 hours and then said, would you use it as a personal favor to me? Well, by lunchtime, I was trying to figure out how to do it better. So, but it was a struggle for me to get from the old philosophy routine and the old psychology routine, because I'd majored in psychology, to get to the idea of being able to count inners. And And it was Diana who really, I mean, just hours and hours and hours of discussion with her on that. And what really hooked me was at that time I was with a guy that was a very negative person. And so we're driving up to my house, which was 35 miles out of town. And and I thought, all right, this is it. I'd already made my first counter. And so I thought, I've got this bead counter here. It's not going to make any noise. I can count the number of negative responses that he gives me. Well, in this 35-mile drive, Rick, he had 0 negatives toward me and 40 positives. And I thought, it just gave me a whole different insight to the relationship. He had, and still does, a very sarcastic tone of voice and sardonic topics, but his words were actually, his words contained no negatives, or very, well, at least during that time period, which was probably about 45 minutes. And that really made me sit back. And I probably called Diana and said, you're not going to believe what just happened. And so that was, in a sense, my first inner project. It was just that 1 day count of 1, but, or that 1 day count, 1 hour, that 1 hour count of 40 positive behaviors and 0 negatives.
Let me jump in here. You have started talking about inner behavior. Maybe before you go on, could you define what that means? What inner behavior means?
Right. Sorry. I've lived with it too long. I take it for granted. Inner behavior is the same as outer behavior, except that it has a different location. It behaves by the same rules, so to speak. I mean, you can reward it, you can punish it, you can count it, you can chart it, you can do a 1-minute timing with it. And it's what goes on inside of you that no one else can observe. You are the only observer. Mm-hmm. And outer behavior, on the other hand, can be observed by somebody else if they're there. Now, it's quite possible that, and I do a lot, count outer behaviors on myself, and there's nobody there to observe it. So someone could take a solipsistic point of view and say, well, did that really occur? And in the same way that many people look at the study of inner behavior and say, well, did that really occur because nobody else can observe it? But we do a lot of outer behaviors that can't be observed as well.
That's a good point, is dealing with something like pain. If you drop a hammer on 100 people's feet and each person reports that hurts, you can make an inference that doing this particular behavior is causing the person pain, even though we can't observe the pain. I mean, we might be able to look at facial grimace or something, but we can't observe the pain that they're feeling. And I think that that's just as legitimate as inner behavior.
Well, that pain is an inner behavior, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I like the way you stated that. Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about inner behavior. Although you're very generous in talking about who may have come up with the original idea, I certainly think of the originator of this. I think of you, because no one that I know of has done more to research this area, to push this area fruitfully to others to think about it, and this is a very, very fascinating area. So why don't you, I guess you started already talking about how did inner behavior occur. Could you talk about some of the projects that you've done and some of the discoveries that you found with inners?
Oh, wow. Let me start off by saying that I was not the one to come up with it. It was Ogg who came up with it in 1966. And he was working on quitting smoking. And actually, I have an article that I need to send out, and I haven't done that yet. And what it is, well, I was trying to get him to find those inner charts and his first inner charts. And he never did find them. But working on the archives, we have found some copies of them. So I've used those, short of having his blue ones. And what he did was he counted cigarette puffs, and then he in the process of doing that, that he sometimes reached for the pack when it was on his desk, or he reached for his pocket, the left breast pocket of his sports coat, and for his cigarette package. And he realized that there was something there that he would call a reach. So you would have the actual smoking behavior, and then you would have a reach behavior. And then he became aware of a slight, what he called an urge before the physical reach started. And that's how we got from takes a puff to reaches for a cigarette to has an urge to have a puff. And that was, as I mentioned, in 1966. I think it was the summer. And then Ann Duncan took over, or I shouldn't say took over, but actually the first inner projects were done after that, were done more by Og, and then Carl Koenig and Ron Holshoe and Ann Duncan. And there were, and Joe Edwards. I may be wrong on that, because it might have been Joe and Diane Edwards with Diane counting fetal kicks, which is not the same kind of an inner behavior, because that's the outer behavior of a fetus. And so, and Ann Duncan did this for quite a while, and she did the first presentation on inner behavior at APA, American Psychological Association, in 1967, I believe it was. And she published the first article in Teaching Exceptional Children, the spring issue of 71. And that was the first publication of an inners chart. And but there's a lot of, it's interesting because there's a lot of historical movement for this, such as Pavlov in his 1927 book on respondent conditioning, what's it called? Conditioned reflexes, talks about seeing such behavior in the dogs when St. Petersburg flooded. And then from there, 10 years later, I mean, I didn't realize this until just the other day when I was putting it into a table. I thought, 10 years after Pavlov's conditioned reflexes, Skinner published Behavior of Organisms. And then it was 1944 when Skinner made a presentation to, I think it was APA, that was then turned into the article on operational behavior, where he mentioned looking at inner behavior, or what he called private events. Mm-hmm. And then we can shift to Og in 1966. Even before that, we'd have Skinner in 1953 in Science and Human Behavior, talks a lot about private events. And then Og in 1966 comes up with a way of counting it. And then Ann, and then it goes from there. Some of the projects, let me see. Let me think for a minute. Two favorites jump to my mind, and they're both projects of mine. One was in 1977, in the fall of 77, I started counting positive thoughts and positive feelings. Positive thoughts, negative thoughts about myself. Positive feelings, negative feelings about myself. Missed opportunities to have a feeling. And my husband and I were having trouble in our marriage, and we were doing a lot of arguing and stuff like that. And I just thought, because I'd already been divorced from my first husband, the sardonic, sarcastic guy, and I thought I can't handle a second divorce. I am not going there. And it was about 3 or 4 weeks from my husband's birthday, and I thought I am going to present him with a better Abigail for his birthday. And I was in counseling, I was writing in my journal every day, I was exercising, I was running, I was doing all kinds of things. And I think there were a couple of more things I was doing too, but none of them seemed to be working. And one day, in total frustration, it was now about 2.5 weeks before his birthday, I just said, oh, for heaven's sakes, I've been using the 1-minute timing on academic behavior, on math and reading for, what would that be, for 9 years now. I'm just going to do a 1-minute timing on this. That's all there is to it. And it was not out of any higher level, sophisticated, intellectual thought about design. It was just a pure gut. I've got to do something. And I did, and it made a difference. And I was absolutely amazed. And I mean, it made a complete difference in my life, Rick. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because when I took the chart into OG, it was a meeting where he was giving me back the proposal for my dissertation. And on that proposal, he had written, very well written, underlined twice, and I think the very had another underlining on it, which I think we all know how infrequently Og gave strong compliments. And it almost knocked me out of my chair. I mean, it was just so incredible to get that back. And I probably really needed that because I said, as he said, is there anything else? After we talked about the proposal, I said, well, yeah, I have some charts here I want to show you. And I thought, and I don't know whether he got up out of his chair. He probably didn't. He must have bounced a couple of times in his chair. He was so excited about those charts, Rick. He said, you have blown psychoanalysis off the map, and you need to change the topic of your dissertation. And I said, Og, I've already been working on this for 2 years now, and this is my proposal, and I've got some of the research in it. I'm going to continue. It was already on inner behavior. It was on how free people feel, how much fun they think they're having when they're learning. And I said, if I drop this and go to the 1-minute timing on inner behavior, I will never go back and pick up the other one. This I will continue with, this 1-minute timing, for the rest of my life. And I want as much inner behavior experience as I can get. And so I really had to convince him to let me stay with my original thesis topic. In a way, I think he was right that I should have changed, because I probably would have published at least a couple of books on that by now. But anyway, it didn't happen that way. And so that article is in the Journal of Precision Teaching. And then I started recommending it with other people. And when I got my PhD, I was a principal, and then I was also teaching as an adjunct. And so I would have some of my teachers would do it, some of the graduate students would do it. And then, of course, and then in the 80s, I mean, it's like I was the only one doing it. And I thought, well, that's okay. And then you did your thesis in the 90s. Doug did his, and then Emma did her dissertation on all of them being the use of the 1-minute timing with inner behavior. Mm-hmm. And I am eternally grateful to the three of you for your work in that, because it takes it away. People can no longer say, well, that's just you, Abigail. That's just the research you've done, because other people have done it as well now.
Yeah.
My other favorite...
I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. I was going to say that everything that you were saying, it's interesting because it is exactly what I came up with. I did some inner work myself before I did my thesis with senior citizens. But so when it has that life-changing effect that there's a behavior that you just can't work with, that really sells it to yourself. But when you start seeing it, what it can do for others, you say, wow, this is really powerful. And there were a number of other people who've done research, especially when I was at Ohio State, where unfortunately, the research didn't get published, but in all of those studies, it was a similar finding where when people did it, whether it was children or children with disabilities, the charts were interesting, that they were replicable, and by and large, most of them were positive.
Right, yeah. I didn't even know that. I that's very exciting that there were others that were going on, because the two you published were just two. Mm-hmm. And now, how many were those the only two that were a part of your thesis, or were there others?
Well, when John Cooper, he supervised other students, and other students would do things. We had an MED program there, and I can remember one student did an MED project, and she did an interesting inner behavior project where she looked at using a mirror, and it was really interesting because she had these kids not only saying things but also looking at the mirror, and she was working with fifth graders, and I think these were kids with SED is the term they use, serious emotional disabilities,
right.
Which we would now call them EBD kids. But that worked very well in that context. But I don't think she ever bothered to publish that. She went on to become a teacher, and at the time I was like, wow, this is such a great project.
That is amazing. How many students did she do that with?
I think she had 4 or 5. I can't remember. This would have been 96, maybe?
So actually, this would be written up in her thesis, though, wouldn't it?
Well, it was an MED project, so I don't know that MED projects are stored as theses are.
Oh.
So unless John Cooper had a record of it, I don't think there'd be a record at the university.
John. Okay.
And recently I had a student who was working in an autistic support classroom, and she had an Asperger's student with Asperger's, and she introduced a 1-minute counting time with him, and unfortunately she couldn't bring that project to fruition because his behaviors became, not just his inner behaviors, but his outer behaviors became problematic to the point where he had to have a change in his setting. But he really was doing very well, and the bead counter that I shared with him was like a lifeline for him, and it was really interesting seeing those effects. So the work that you did, I see it being done, and hopefully it continues to be replicated with not just different ages, but people with disabilities, of gender, and just as many people as we can that need it. This should be something that could and should be used.
Right. I've had, and I don't think this is going to come to fruition, but I had an opportunity that was a great learning experience for me of training 6 or 7 people on a clinical psychological team, I probably should say, or clinical services team that are working with soldiers who have PTSD. And I sat in on a couple of the soldier groups and was able to see that. This is an area that is just perfect for this kind of work. Mm-hmm. But in sitting in on the group, I counted their positive, negative, and neutral remarks about them, each soldier about himself. And then I counted their positive, negative, and neutral remarks about others. And the difference, and in both cases, but this is taking it as a group count, this was very informal, of course, 8 soldiers, and the total number of counts on themselves, the difference, on both of those counts, the negative statements were higher than the positive statements. So wow. The ratio of the positives to the negatives about self, the negatives were times 3.6 higher than the positives.
When I hear that, that just makes me believe of, well, it actually, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that really is exciting to hear you making that kind of observation, because for so long, I can remember when you and I were presenting, and we presented at ABA before, there's always this resistance in behavior analysis that, if not, again, I don't want to paint with a broad brush here. This isn't everybody, but this is a lot of people who say, well, it's the methodological behaviorist rearing its ugly head, saying, well, since we can't observe it, it doesn't exist. But yet, what you're doing is so culturally relevant and so important that people who are interested in numbers and just think of, I'm just thinking of all the wonderfully positive things you can do based on that observation. I mean, looking at inners and matching that up. What's an inners count for post-traumatic stress? What's an inners count for depression? What's an inners count for, you put the label on there. I mean, that's really just a fascinating observation that you made. Sorry, you got me excited with that. Let me continue.
That's great. I love to hear that. The rest of that observation is that their negative comments about other people were times 9 higher than their positive comments about others, which is, a pretty large difference between those two counts, between the about self and the about others. Now, one of the things, just looking at the, not looking at all of the charts, I'll need to go back and look at Doug's and yours and other inner charts that people have done. But looking at Emma's, the projects that Emma Cobain has done with or had people do, and the ones that I have, basically you need to end up at the end of the project with the positive comments a minimum of times 10, and preferably more like times 20 or higher, over the negative self-thoughts and
what
feelings.
Does that do when that happens?
What that does is it means that the positives are high enough that if there's a negative, you have enough positives going on about yourself in your world that it will counter those negatives. And I'm not saying that it has to be this way. I'm just saying that the charts end up this way, that you have about a times 10 or 20 difference between the all-day positives and negatives, whether it's thoughts or feelings or combining the thoughts and feelings. Do you understand what I mean?
I do.
Okay.
And it would be interesting, too, in this research you're talking about, does that take into account maintenance or how long these would persist?
Yeah. Good question. And with many of these projects, it does, you end the project that way. And then I have some, and I think all of Emma's are this way. She has 22, 22 projects that are in her dissertation that she ended up with, and I have some that end up with a 3-week gap, a 4-week gap, a 6-week gap. I have one that's a 9-year gap, except I don't have the counts, and I actually could get the counts from the person. But where the after phase looks very much like the very last phase of using let me back up a minute. You have the during, where you have it's the intervention. And so you have the 1-minute timing going on while you're counting the all-day positive thoughts and the all-day negative thoughts, or feelings. They could be feelings, or urges for that matter. And then you end the intervention and you have an after phase where it's just like the before phase or the baseline that you did. There's no intervention going on there at all. The gap in counting comes next. So you have anywhere from a 3 to a 6-week gap in counting. And then you go back and you do another baseline phase. And basically there's no change.
Okay. So with the inner behavior, that's really interesting, an interesting phenomenon. But have you had a chance or have you looked at the relationship between inner and outer behavior, or are they independent?
I have taken a very brief look at that, and I presented that at one of the, at the conference in Provo, or was it, we haven't had one in Provo, it must have been in Salt Lake City. And I don't remember what the end of that study was, and I think there are a couple of others that have looked at the relationship between the inner and outer, and they are independent. Well, my dissertation looked at the relationship between the inner and the outer behaviors, and they clearly are independent. I looked at co-celeration. Did they co-celerate or counter-celerate? Did they co-vary or counter-vary? And then was there an independent where you'd have a flat line on one and an accelerating on the positives or a decelerating on the negatives? And of course, that one is a variation of the counter-cellerating. But basically what you have is or counter-variability, you have about 40%, if I remember, 30 or 40%, about 35 or 40%, I think, of the behaviors are, let me think, I didn't bring that with me. They counter-vary. So you don't have, I can't remember the percentages, Rick. So
that's okay.
But basically what you have is they're independent. You cannot, in the same way with, if you do it with reading or if you do it with all inner behavior or any outer behavior, any inner behavior, if you take a look at them as a pair, they don't vary together. So they are independent.
That makes sense to me for a number of reasons. I recently have completed a book chapter, and as part of this book chapter, I recharted an article from a journal which is on social stories. I don't know if you're familiar with social stories, but what social stories, there's a number of ways that the intervention is supposed to work. One way is that the student reads this story, and in the story there's some kind of message like, don't hit people or don't be sad, and they're supposed to have an effect on the student's behavior. Almost like, okay, this thing that you're reading is going to affect your outer behavior, but what I saw when I recharted that behavior is it had the exact opposite effect, which shows, at least in that instance, they seem to be independent, that if you think you're doing something to target the inner behavior, that's not necessarily going to touch the outer behavior.
Right,
and
Augie
used to say that too. It was interesting. I remember an interview with him once where, or maybe this was an article, now I'm forgetting, but his basic idea was you could have someone who could be the school president but have hundreds of mean thoughts versus a person who is a very a murderer or a sociopath who has many positive thoughts.
Absolutely.
Really, that independence is something that's a striking discovery.
Mm-hmm. This is definitely an area that needs more research. We need to have people take a look at at a paired inner-outer behavior. And the end of what we have so far is not as big as it should be. Mm-hmm. And some of that comes from, some of the data come from the mid-'60s when Ogden, the graduate students at that time, were working on this. And then some of them come from just some that I put together when I had both sets of behaviors, and I was able to put those together. So I don't know whether Emma has any of those in her dissertation or not. But I'd taken one of the short courses, and you got money back if you made those deposits. So to their credit, I taught 12 hours of graduate school that summer to a group of probably 17 18 students who were all teachers within the Federal Way school system. And 4 or 5 of them drove down from Seattle to Eugene, which is, I think, over 300 miles. And they drove down, and we sat at my dining room table and filled out all of those forms. And it was absolutely fun. We had a delightful time. And in fact, I was pregnant. I think that was why they decided that I should not do the driving. Anyway, I'm sitting here with the Behavior Bank, and when you look at a project, you have these categories: procedures used, pinpoint, adds facts correctly. And we have 9 behaviors on that. If you have less than 5, it didn't make it into the Behavior Bank. And then you have what the record floor was, what the program event was, or what the program was, which would be time, program event, the arrangement, and the arranged event, and then the procedures that were used. And that's on one page. So if you have the notebook open, it's horizontal. You're looking at that. And then the page that you also can see is a chart that has first phase, in the middle, then best phase, and then on the left is first phase, and then best phase and best in the middle, and multipliers on the right. And you have the pinpoints of the first phase, the initial pinpoint and the ending pinpoint, and then you also have the best improvement, the middle improvement, and the worst improvement from connected dots. And then on the best, you have the best acceleration, 3 lines, best, middle, and worst, and you have the best, middle, and worst frequency. And then on the multipliers, you have 2 things. You have the frequency multiplier from the first dot to, or excuse me, that would be the last dot to the first dot of the next phase. And again, best, middle, and worst. And then you also have the accelerations. So, and you have 3 of those: the best acceleration, the worst acceleration, and the middle acceleration. And the final count, Hank said he couldn't remember what the final count was. There are 3 separate notebooks that were published. One was in 1969, and that may have just been a list. I don't know whether that had charts with it or not. I can't remember. I have one in Oregon, and I saw one in Kansas City recently. But the second notebook is in one notebook and was published in 71 with about, well, that's the one I've got right in front of me. And that has, it has about 11 or 12,000 charts. And then the, 11,947 charts. And then there was a later one published in 2 notebooks. One has the charts in it, and the other has all of the secondary sheets, which give you the details of everything. And that one contains, I think, about 15 or 16,000 charts. All told, we ended up with 32,198 charts. And that was according to an article. I'm citing Ogg's article from 1990, and I don't remember what the title of it was. It's in the Journal of Precision Teaching, though. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we have, 32,198. And each one of those has a minimum of 21 days on the charted data.
And you've talked about some of the discoveries that were made based on that large volume of charted behavior. Could you talk about a couple of those discoveries?
Yeah, let's see. Well, one of them, and this is actually not a discovery, but maybe more of a realization that I think is extremely important, and that is that what we know about human behavior from the chart and the behavior bank is inductive. It's like the sun rises every morning and it sets every night, and we know that that's going to happen tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And all of that comes from, that's based originally on inductive reasoning. Well, if it rose yesterday, we assume it will rise tomorrow. and we assume it will rise the next day and the next day. And all of that is based on our inductive reasoning, which comes from our experience, and it's doing it again and again and again. So what we did within precision teaching was we collected over 32,000 projects rather than setting up a deductive study of saying, well, what will happen if we do this? We say, let's see what happens when we do this. And we go out and collect the data, and then we draw these conclusions from that. And I don't know, and it's analogous to, it's the same way that we learn things in chemistry and physics and astronomy. I mean, we're not going to go out and do an experiment to learn what happens in astronomy, for heaven's sakes. So we just take all of these data and we collect them and we collect them and we collect them, and then we draw conclusions from them. Therefore, the sun will come up tomorrow. And I think that is a very, very important piece of the chart, and I think it's important because that is what makes us a natural science, not a social science.
I am very glad to hear you say that, because whenever I meet people, I always describe myself as a natural scientist who's working in a social scientific world. Mm-hmm. And so much of what I do is being a scientist first, and it's great being in this community of precision teachers and standard acceleration charters, because that is a pervasive theme, that we're applying science and we're applying it to socially significant areas, education, mm-hmm. psychology, or whatever we have. But as we're approaching the end of this interview, let me ask, are there any questions that I should have asked you, or any other comments you'd like to make to our audience before we leave?
Let me see. Well, there's one thing. Well, there are two things, actually. One of the questions you asked Hank was paper versus computer charts. And I would like to answer that one. I love my paper charts. And when I do my own projects, I prefer to use the paper charts. But I do deal with the computer ones, and I'll turn them into a computer chart or have somebody else do it for me when I'm required to have a computer chart. So, I think it's both ways. And one of the things in talking to the people at this particular Army fort was, these soldiers are not going to use a piece of chart paper. And so what I did was I had it set up, or what I've done is I have it set up to go with computer charting. Now, whether it goes on this particular fort or whether it goes somewhere else, I don't know. But I do know that I now have a system for doing a big project like that using computer charts, and that I will do because it'll be easier for people who are having some pretty serious difficulties. Probably the other thing I would like to say, and I don't know whether any of us come into precision teaching through the normal channel, but I certainly didn't come in the way many people have done. My animal training consisted of rat sitting for Nancy's rat, Nancy Hughes Lindsley's rat, called Rat On, when she and Og were going on vacation somewhere or conference or whatever, and I had to take this little rat through his slalom course every day and feed him accordingly, which was great fun. I mean, the Rat On and I got on very well. I really enjoyed him. And then my other one was training my dogs to keep the bears away from, to keep them north of my house, because south of my house, within a 2 square block area, live about 20 children. And fathers were shooting the bears because they thought they would attack the children. And it created a huge problem in the neighborhood, especially if they didn't kill the bear when they shot it and it was dark. And probably a half a dozen people in my neighborhood don't have indoor plumbing. So, you don't want to be wandering out in the middle of the night with a wounded bear. So I trained my dogs using Karen Pryor's clicker training to keep the bears up north. And that was a fabulous project. I did some counts, but it's very hard. Believe me, it's very hard to have the dogs be 5-10 feet from a bear, have me be 15 to 10 feet from a bear behind the dogs, and be clicking the dogs and to be counting what's going on at the same time. So I can't say that I have accurate counts, but I can say that I trained the dogs to chase the bears away.
I think that may be one of the most intense behavior projects I think I've ever heard of. I mean, I've worked with some tough kids before, but that brings it to a whole nother level.
That's delightful, Rick. Yeah, it does. I've worked with some really tough kids too, but fortunately I didn't have to restrain this bear, and he didn't get close enough to restrain me. So I think those were my only additional comments.
Okay. Well, let me thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to talk with us. Hopefully, we'll be able to have you on again, as these interviews always go too fast and there's always more to talk about.
Right. I do have two more statements, actually. Do I have time?
Okay. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. One of them is that one of the things precision teaching does is that it does not sacrifice standards of measurement. That's another thing that makes me committed to it. If I'm asking someone to take my blood pressure or to do an MRI or a CT scan, I know what I'm going to get. And if I'm using precision teaching in the same light, I know what I'm going to get. I'm going to get the clear data. And then the other thing that I wanted to say was, I wanted to acknowledge, as I did in the email recently, Hjorter, or the posting, what Ribbons in the Sky that's posted on Scroll in Space, that particular chapter, acknowledging Hjorter and Humboldt, who spent thousands of hours counting the behavior of the aurora borealis. And this was, 200 years ago? Yeah, 200 years ago, over 200 years ago. And they didn't know what they were going for. They don't even now understand fully the aurora borealis. And the main research center in the Western world is in Fairbanks, Alaska. And they'll be the first to tell you, hey, we just made a new discovery, or we don't know that about it. And so I think, to put it all in perspective, that we're like Hjorter and Humboldt, walking around trying to find what's going on with human behavior, as they were trying to find what was going on with all these electrical or lights or whatever that was going on. They didn't even know then that they were electrical charges. And I think we need to be patient with ourselves, that it will take us a couple hundred years, but we need to keep doing this. And if I had a picture of either one of those fellows, I'd probably post it above my desk to just remind me that this is a long journey.
Well, thank you very much, Abigail, for, again, spending your time. And sure. I'll look forward to maybe having you on again in the future, and certainly seeing you at the upcoming PT conference. That interview was with Abigail Calkin, and I'm always amazed at how much I learn when I have a chance to talk to all of our interview guests in person, because you hear the personal stories, and you have an opportunity to really hear what their research means to them and how they came up with it. And certainly that was another very, very good interview. We are now at the end of our podcast, and I would like to, on behalf of Doug and myself, thank all of you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next month.